Hi, welcome everybody to Max Dunn's GreenTalk, Dirty Secrets of Clean Energy. Thrilled to be inviting Max Dunn back to give a green talk. He was here about a year ago. Max is the Director of Engineering at a company called Ohm Connect, and he has a kind of renaissance education in a technical sense. He started with a degree in engineering at UC Berkeley, physics, and then straight away did a computer science and information degree at UCSC. He's worked in companies building collaborative websites, and he did an MBA, Masters of Business Administration, at Presidio Graduate College in San Francisco to focus in the engineering of sustainable business. And I would like you to give him a warm welcome. Thanks, Max.
Thanks, everyone. Is the mic on? Can you guys all hear me okay? Yeah. Great. On January 6, 2014, the polar vortex descended over Texas, bringing with it record low temperatures. Now, in Texas, about 2/3 of the homes are heated by electricity, so this also brought electricity demand to record highs. This imbalance in the grid between the supply and the demand was caused in large part because there was a lot of the traditional generators that were knocked offline because they had frozen cooling pipes, transmitters, and other sensors. So to protect the grid operators were scrambling, and they were going to implement rolling blackouts to turn off power to people, which would cause their heaters to go off and make them very cold. However, at the same time, the wind was blowing fiercely, and Texas has a lot of wind energy. And due in a large part to that extra wind energy, they were able to avert this grid problem, and people had power during the low record temperatures. Score one for renewable energy. Yet in 2014, about 20% of the wind power in China was wasted because they didn't have the infrastructure to take it to where it was needed. And this is not limited to just China. Every country in the world, the US included, has this problem where we're dumping wind power, either because it's being produced at night when it's not needed, or it's too far away from where it is needed. Critics point to examples like this as to why we can't rely on renewable energy. And that's not the only thing. There's other dirty secrets of renewable energy. Hi, my name is Max Dunn. Josh gave you a little bit of my background. And one of the things I wanted to mention, the sustainable MBA I did, I studied a lot on vehicle to grid, actually using your cars to power the grid is a subject I'm really fascinated with and really like to see. And in 2015, after I sold my last company, I took some time off to be with my kids, surf, and learn Ruby on Rails. I really started looking at this problem of fossil fuels and realizing we're running out. There's just so much oil and natural gas in the ground. And what we really need to do is to move to a renewable energy society. But there are challenges in the way. So I've really devoted my life to solving those challenges. And we'll be talking about some of those things today. Now, the way I do presentations is a little bit different because I don't have a lot of words and things on the screen. They're more just pictures to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about and to also remind me what I should be talking about next. But if you go to this link, ohm.co/energy, you'll find a paper that has all of the information with all of the references for the things I'm talking about. And there's also a link to this presentation if you're interested in seeing it. I like to use Prezi. It's kind of a fun thing. You might enjoy taking a look at that. All right, so what are some of the dirty secrets of renewable energy? Well, the first thing to realize is that the electric grid has almost no storage on it. The instant an electron is produced, it needs to be used. Along the wire, there's no storage, there's no place to put that. The supply of energy has to be instantly balanced with demand. And this is a theme that's going to run throughout this whole talk, this challenge of balancing the grid. Now, it's a little bit hard to understand, so I have an analogy. So I wanted to ask, did anyone ride their bicycle to school today? Got a hand up there. How far did you ride?
7 miles.
And about how fast do you ride, do you know?
80 miles an hour.
80?
18.
18, all right. 80 would be better, but 18's good. What's your name?
Lucas.
Lucas, all right. Well, here's Lucas on his bicycle. And he's going to be the electric grid today. We're all going to rely on Lucas to provide our power. But here's the thing. He has to ride at exactly 18 miles an hour the whole way. If he rides slower, that's like the grid not having enough power. We'll have brownouts, there won't be enough electricity. If he rides too fast, there's too much power on the grid, and that can cause problems too. So 18 miles an hour exactly. Now on flat ground, that's pretty easy. He can do that. Might be a little bump or a little wind, but he can keep going. But when Lucas hits a hill, he's got to pedal a lot harder to get up that hill. Because remember, he's got to go 18 miles an hour exactly. Now when he hits a downhill, that's kind of nice. He can stop pedaling or pedal less. But he can't go faster than 18. You can't be coasting down that hill. That's bad too. So you've got to be putting on the brakes and making sure your speed is 18 miles an hour all the time. So Lucas, we're going to be depending on you today to power that grid exactly the right way. Now this is so sensitive that anytime anything is, more electricity is used or less electricity is used, a power plant somewhere has to compensate. So let's say I turn up the lights here. Did you guys hear that? There's a power plant nearby that had to ramp up just a little bit. And because of that, there's a grid imbalance. There's another power plant that had to adjust throughout the entire grid. Every electron that we use has to be produced someplace. Now when I go back here and turn down the lights again, the power plant can go down a little bit less. So it is constantly balancing, even with things just like turning on the lights and turning off the lights. So the takeaway from this is that supply on the grid has to instantly match the demand. Now, of course, renewable energy, a lot of it is intermittent. Even sun, where we know the sun's going to come up at a certain time and go down at a certain time, if there's clouds, we can get output like this. Clouds go over, power goes away, comes back up. And you see these are very sharp spikes here. Same thing with wind. We can have lulls and gusts. This is from actually California wind plant, and we can see the wind going up and the lulls and gusts. It's not constant. And that causes a problem because of these fluctuations, because the grid has to adjust. Now, how does the grid adjust? Now, this goes into this concept of ramp rates. And this is kind of a technical term. It has to do with power plants, how quickly they can change their power. Now, most of the traditional generators are thermal-based. They're based on heat. Nuclear is nuclear fuel. I'll talk a lot about fossil fuels, meaning coal, mainly natural gas. There's some oil, too. But these things take a long time to start up and a long time to ramp. A nuclear power plant, for instance, they want to run all the time at the constant rate. They don't like to shut off. They don't like to run at any different rates. If a nuclear power plant does get shut off, it can take days, 3-4 days or more, to get it back up to speed. A lot of it has to do with just the heat. You have to get things spinning, get the heat distributed, get the moisture out of there. If you don't, there's going to be a lot of problems. Now, coal, a lot of big coal-fired power plants take a long time, too. The older ones can take days to come up. Some of the newer technology, they can bring it up in hours. But it's not very good about following fluctuations. You don't want to ramp those things up and down. With gas-fired, there's several different types. The most efficient, which is getting 60 or 70% efficiency, is a combined cycle gas turbine, CCGT. And these have multiple different stages in order to really maximize the amount of efficiency they get out. But they take a long time, too. They can take days or hours. Now, some of the simpler ones, just the single-cycle ones, they can come up in minutes. They've been optimized to come pretty fast, and they can ramp. Now, just for comparison, I also put on here hydro, which just takes seconds or minutes, and solar PV, which takes seconds. We'll talk more about this later. But the main takeaway from this is that traditional generators don't ramp that fast. Now, someone once asked me, how do you turn on a gas turbine? What's the process, turning on from start? So I was joking around. I reached in and got the fob from my car. I said, well, you just walk in there and you click on it and it starts. So that's not really the way it works. It's a very complicated process. And this diagram is from some training software that teaches plant operators how to bring up a gas turbine, all the different things that you have to do. And I'm showing it just to show you the complexity of doing it because traditional generators really do have a hard time ramping and following those fluctuations. Now, the other problem is time of day. Now, the electricity usage, we use about half as much electricity as night as during the day, which makes sense. There's not as much going on at night. And the peak usage comes in the summer months when we've got all our air conditioning on. So this follows solar pretty well. You know, when the sun is out is when it's hot. When we're about, we can get a lot of the power. So that's good. However, when the sun starts going down at 5 or 6, we're now going home and we're cooking dinners, we're turning on TV, and our usage peaks. And it peaks after the sun is actually down. So if we were to rely on renewable energy alone, that means we could not get rid of any of the old dirty fossil fuel power plants. We need them all for when the sun goes down. So this is that mismatch between when the sun produces and when we need it. Now, wind also, of course, is variable. In California, it tends to blow at night. We don't need more electricity at night, we need less. So there's that mismatch there. So the takeaway from this is just that the sun and wind are not perfectly aligned with the demand for electricity. Now, I'm going to be focusing on this presentation a lot on solar and wind because those are the predominant sources of renewable energy and also the intermittent ones that cause a lot of problems. But there's other sources of renewable energy. Does anyone know some of the other, say, non-carbon producing sources of energy that we have in use in the United States today? Hydroelectric dams, right. Yeah, a lot of hydropower. And hydropower is great. I mean, once the dams are there, it's clean, it is reliable, we can turn it on and off. Unfortunately, it causes a lot of environmental damage, and so they're actually taking out dams now instead of putting it in. But that's a good source. Anything else? Nuclear. Yeah, nuclear is a really interesting one. There's a lot of debate in the community. Renewable energy is nuclear good? Do we need nuclear to get to a non-carbon future? Of course, the operation of a nuclear power plant does not produce carbon. But the construction, of course, does. One of the things I did in my MBA was a life cycle analysis of a nuclear-powered plant to see if all of the concrete and everything that they did produced more carbon than the generation than it was worth. And the answer was no. It's actually a fairly carbon-efficient way of producing electricity, but of course there's lots of other problems. In California, we used to have 3 nuclear power plants, and I think we're down to 1. They're decommissioning them now, so nuclear just doesn't look like it's going to be an important part of the renewable energy mix. Any other ones? Geothermal, yeah. Anyone been to the geysers up in Northern California? It's one of the largest geothermal plants in the country. Geothermal is really nice. It's base load. They have to kind of keep it running all the time. It's also very geographically dependent. It really relies on having hot rocks close to the surface where you can drill down and get to it. So there's just not a lot of opportunity there to be putting in geothermal all over. Anyone interested in biomass? That comes up sometimes. You know, we have a lot of waste from farming and other things, and you can burn it. And it's actually carbon neutral. Even though you're burning it, releasing the CO2, whatever it took to burn captures the CO2. So there is some of that going on. So we won't talk much about those other things just because they tend to be more constant and don't contribute to the problems on the grid, but also aren't as predominant. Now, another problem is distance. In the US, most of the population is on the coast, the east and the west coasts. And these are the power lines running there. And we do have some pretty good power lines on those sides moving power around. However, the best solar resources are in the southwest. We don't have a lot of power lines running there. The best wind resources are in the Midwest. There's some offshore. We have some pretty good offshore, but there's some difficulties with permitting and engineering of doing that. So there's actually a lot of wind right now in the Midwest, but not a lot of power lines going to it. So it's nice that we've got that, but if we can't get it to where it's needed, it's not going to do us much good. Now that's kind of a large scale, but even on a more local geography, location is important. And this is a chart showing all of the electric lines around San Jose around here. And if anyone can follow those and find out where they start and end, you win an extra prize, because I can. It's kind of a hodgepodge. During the last storms, did anyone lose power at all during this winter? Got someone here? What's the longest? How long did you lose power for?
I don't even know because I left my house.
And it came back on. Did anyone lose it for more than a day? Okay, we have one. How long did you lose it for?
I think like 2 days.
2 days, yeah. Yeah, I lost power for about 2 days. You know, there's a lot in the mountains of power outages, so that's where PG&E was focusing on fixing the large number of customers. I was in this small neighborhood where there weren't that many houses affected, so we were like the last ones. And it was really frustrating because like across the street they had power, and we didn't. And that's because of this. You know, the power lines are just a big hodgepodge. Now, to tell you a little secret, I actually ran my house on my electric leaf off the battery for 2 days. So we had power where no one else did. So if anyone's interested in doing that, let me know. Okay, so this brings us to my favorite part of this presentation, the geekiest part. And there's a little bit of background to understand what's going on here. This is actually a price map from the California ISO site. You can go and look at it right now. But this talks about wholesale prices. Now, when we as consumers pay for electricity, we're paying retail. And there's basically like two types. One is tiered. So we start off at kind of a low rate, and then once we use this base thing, we go up and up. And it's designed to encourage us to save electricity. Now, another dirty secret, in the Midwest, there's places that pay you a discount for the more electricity you use. Use a lot, pay a lot little, encourages more consumption. But in California, because we're deregulated, we try and reduce the amount. The other way we pay it is through a time of use. So in the middle of the day, you pay more, at night you pay less. And this helps match the retail prices with the wholesale prices the utilities pay. Now, a typical wholesale price would be these bubbles in the green here, which is about $30 to $50 a megawatt hour. Now, when we pay electricity, we pay for it in kilowatt hour. So we pay like 15 cents or 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's a little confusing that we're now talking megawatt hour. But the conversion is pretty straightforward. A $50 megawatt hour is 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So you can kind of do the math. And we'll kind of talk more about megawatt hours from now on. So the utilities buy electricity at 5 cents a kilowatt hour and sell it to us for 15 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's how they make their money. So typically in this map, you would see a lot of green, which is the grid operating normally, and the utilities paying the normal price for it. However, these red bubbles are where the price is higher. In this case, they're $220 a megawatt hour, gone up from 50 to 220, pretty big jump. We've actually seen this go to $1,000 or $2,000. And what's going on here is that Luke isn't writing fast enough. The hill's getting steeper, there's more demand than there is supply, and they need to get more generation on the grid at this point. And this is how they do it, how the main mechanism they use to balance this grid is that they charge different prices depending on where you put it on the grid. This is called locational marginal pricing, or LMP. And basically it's saying that power put on the grid where it's needed is more valuable than power put on the grid where it's not needed. And the California ISO runs this market to adjust these prices so they get power where they need it. In this case, there's people going to fire up older, dirty power plants to provide this power to balance the grid. We don't like that type of power, but sometimes we need it. Right? And this happens fairly frequently, that they need to adjust the grid and they pay people more to put more power on the grid. But this is what I find fascinating about this map that just blows my mind. These blue dots, this is where prices are negative. Try and wrap your head around what that means, a negative electricity price. Well, this means if you use electricity, they're going to pay you. The more you use, the more you get. That's a pretty sweet deal, huh? but putting power on it, the generators, they have to pay to put power on it. Now that hill's gotten steep. You're going downhill, you're going too fast, you got to put those brakes on, because otherwise you're going to blow up the grid because there's too much power on the grid. So this is happening more and more with renewable energy, where prices go negative. There's so much renewable energy on the grid that sometimes they need to curtail the other renewable energy on the grid. Now, but this is also fascinating, because why would this happen right next door to each other? Why right here are prices negatives, there's too much power, and right here prices are positive, there's not enough? Well, in the Central Valley, we get a lot of the utility scale solar. There's a lot of solar out there. Not a lot of people, so they need to move it in to San Francisco and the Bay Area where it's actually needed. There's a mountain range right here, not very populated, and there's just a few transmission lines. So my guess is that transmission line went down. Maybe it overheated, there's too much on there, maybe a squirrel bit through that. But all of a sudden, we've got a case where we have all this power we don't need in the Central Valley and not enough power on the coast. And so that's why we get these crazy prices of the positive and negatives right next to each other. I love this graph because it really illustrates this idea of the challenge of balancing power. Even though we've got great solar energy, if we can't get to where it's needed, it doesn't do us any good. So the takeaway from this is congestion can prevent balancing. All right, now, here's another thing I love. It's called the duck curve. And to understand the duck curve, we first need to look at renewable energy on the grid. Now, unfortunately, it's a little hard to see this yellow and light blue lines, but this is a chart from last year. This is, again, online. The light blue line is wind, and the yellow line is the solar. Now, this was a pretty good day because we did have wind throughout the day. We can tell it's a winter day because the sun came up about 6 and 7 and went down about 5. So this is a nice winter day showing the solar power on the grid in California. All right, now I got another quiz for you guys. What is the record in California for the percentage of renewable energy on the grid? Does anyone know? I'll give you a clue. A few years ago, it was about 30%. Any guesses? 40%. We have 40. Do I hear 45? Anyone have 45? 45. Can I have 47? It's actually 50%. We hit that on March 11th, just a few months ago. And you can see this graph goes up to about 5 gigawatts or so. We're now getting about 9, almost 10 gigawatts of solar energy. Since we did this, it's almost doubled. It's an incredible amount. Great, right? More solar energy on the grid. Everyone's got to love that, right? Well, there's a problem. And the problem has to do with this duck curve. The blue line right here is the total demand. And it looks pretty normal at night. People aren't using a lot. They start waking up. We use some. We go to work. It's a little bit less. We come home at night, cook dinner, turn on the TV, turn on the lights. We use more. This green line is what's called the net demand. It means the total demand minus the renewables. Another way of looking at it is this green line is what the traditional fossil-fueled power plants need to provide on the grid. And if we think about the yellow line, it makes sense that as the sun starts coming up, we don't need them as much. It goes down and then come back up. So that's great, right? Turn off all those dirty power plants, let the sun come in, and then turn them back on. Well, here's the problem right here is this ramp right here. Because we saw before, traditional power plants don't like to ramp fast. And the more solar we have on there, the more renewables, the faster they're going to have to ramp to keep that up. So when the sun goes down, boy, those things have to come up real fast. And this curve is called the duck curve because it kind of looks like the belly of a duck and the head of a duck. And California ISO is now talking about some ways of solving some of the problems. They're talking about flattening the duck and fattening the duck. So be aware of these analogies. So this is a problem. It requires fast ramp, traditional generators. Now, we can take this to an extreme. And to understand this, you have to understand a little bit about how electricity works. In essence, electricity flows downhill. Starts at the generator, goes through the transmission lines to a substation, more transmission lines, a neighborhood transformer to your house. At the generator, it's a higher voltage. Every step of the way, the voltage comes down. It flows nicely down to your house. Works great, right? Well, if you put solar PV on your roof, a lot of times during the day, you're going to be producing more than you're using. Where does that go? It's got to go somewhere, right? Well, it goes back on the grid. And the way it goes back on the grid is the voltage needs to come up a little bit. Not much, just a little bit. Puts that power back on your grid so your neighbors can use it, and other people in your neighborhood can use it. That all works fine, but what happens when in your block everyone has solar? Well, you've got to raise the voltage a little bit to put it on the grid. They've got to raise it, they've got to raise it, they've got to raise it, they've got to raise it. And at a certain point, there's too much electricity on the grid. And that's bad. It can cause motors to burn out. It can cause fires from wires overheating. So what happens is the breakers trip if that happens, and you lose all your power. So this is one of the problems with backfeed on the grid. So in Hawaii, it's a very unique situation. Hawaii has some of the highest electricity prices in the country, mainly because they need to ship over all the oil to run it. It's 30, 40 cents a kilowatt hour. They also have a lot of sun. Hey, great conditions for putting solar PV on your roof. A lot of people have done it. It's almost, I think it's about 30% penetration of solar PV. 30% of people have it on their houses. But the problem is there's now too much of it. And we saw the duck curve come down where the curve came down. You had to turn off some of our plants. This is a case that happened where they actually went negative at this transformer, which means that all the other sources of electricity had to turn off, but we still were putting more on the grid. That hill is so steep, you're squeezing your brakes as tight as you can, and you're still picking up speed. That's a problem. Hawaii's put a moratorium on more solar PV till they figure this out. And they're instituting some things to help with that. But it's a big problem for Hawaii, also because they're an island, they can't easily export that other places. So in Hawaii, they call this the Nessie curve, after the Loch Ness monster, because they really consider this problem to be a monster. It's not a duck, it's a monster problem that they're really having a hard time solving. So too much solar is not good. All right, so we've looked at a lot of the problems for putting renewable energy on the grid, and so I don't think we can surmount those. So thanks, everyone. You've been a great crowd. Really appreciate it. Oh, wait. Oh, that's right. I do have some things that might actually help solve this. So let's look at a few of those. The first thing is economics. Regardless what any politicians say, the economics of solar and wind is becoming incredible. When it was first invented back in the 70s, it was like $100. It's just very high. I did a calculation a few years ago where it looked like if solar fell below $2 for a watt for a panel, it would be competitive with coal. It's now, this says 61 cents. Actually, this is old too. It's down to less than 50 cents for the panel for producing that. Prices have come down incredibly, and of course, demand has gone up. So we've put in 65 gigawatts of solar. Now, to give you an idea, a big nuclear power plant produces about a gigawatt. That's a big friggin' plant. So we've put in the equivalent of 65, but perfectly clean power plants. Now, if you look at it compared to other forms of energy, the real nice thing about renewable energy, of course, is you don't have to pay for fuel costs. For coal, for natural gas, you've got kind of a minimum because you're paying for that cost to drive it. But you also have the cost of building the plant and maintaining it. Well, with solar, not a lot to maintain. You got to go wipe off the solar cells now and then, replace some of the inverters that have burned out. Not a lot of cost. So most of your cost is just amortizing your construction costs. Same with wind. Once you put them up, there's almost no cost. There's maintenance and things, but there's not a lot. So as the technology price comes down, we'll keep seeing lower and lower prices for renewable energy, where we're not going to see that for coal and natural gas because you've got this floor. And already we're seeing it lower. Now, for the solar utility scale, this says $60 a megawatt hour. There's just recently a tender in India where they bid, I think it was $47. So remember we saw that chart, they're paying $30 to $50 a megawatt hour for electricity on the grid. We're now doing that with solar. We've now got solar below $50 a megawatt hour. So from a pure economic standpoint, it doesn't matter what the politicians say about whether coal is better or not, renewable energy is winning from an economic value. Now another thing is transmission lines. We saw how a lot of times the sun is shining and the wind is blowing where we're not using it, and that's true. But we are starting to build more transmission lines to move that around. Now a traditional alternating current or AC power line is not very efficient at moving electricity. You lose a lot. You can lose 10% or more of that, transporting that around. But they have what's called DC or direct current transmission lines, which are much more efficient at moving electricity long distances. So they have a lot of these planned now all throughout the world of building these. Now imagine if we connected the East Coast to the West Coast in the United States so we could put power anywhere and put a bunch of solar back on the East Coast. So we wake up in the morning, still kind of dark, we're stumbling around, we put in our toaster, put in our toast. Well, we have solar energy driving that even though our sun's not up. Now let's say we also put a line under the ocean to Hawaii and we're pulling a lot of the solar energy from there. So then we come home, it's dark out, we want to watch Game of Thrones and cook a pizza, and now we're pulling energy from Hawaii to do that. And let's take that a step further. Saudi Arabia just announced they want to do 10% of their power from solar. They're the largest oil producer in the world, and they're looking at solar for their own needs. They also have a lot of sun over there and a lot of land. It's a good place to do it. So imagine if we ran those lines around the world, so in the middle of the night, we're pulling solar from Saudi Arabia to power our homes and industry, and in their night, they're pulling from us. We could run the entire world on solar energy if we have enough transmission lines. Now also, the traditional generators are helping out too. They've recognized that they need to ramp more, and so gas turbines, they're designing these to be able to ramp faster, to fill in those peaks and valleys, and also to start and stop more so they can stop them completely and start them up again. And this is not an easy thing to do, but they're putting in more of these in place to do that. That's one thing Hawaii has done, is they have diesel generators and some gas generators, but they've redesigned those to ramp more quickly to be able to account for that Nessie curved neck as the sun goes down. Now, another thing that happens with the solar is that we've been very conservative with how we put that on the grid. When you put solar on your roof, and we have these solar inverters, they will wait for 5 minutes after they see power before they go on. You think you could be able to run your house on solar, right? You've got that on your roof. If the power goes out, you can run it. But that's not the way it works. These are designed to turn off if there's no power. One of the big reasons is that this protects line workers. If a power line goes down and someone's there fixing it, you could electrocute them if you put power back on the grid. But in addition to that, if they notice any disturbance in the grid, the voltage goes down, or if the frequency slows down, or voltage goes up a little bit, they'll just shut off completely too. And that is because we're being very conservative about it. We want to make sure they don't contribute to grid instability. But that actually makes it worse. If we have a day where we don't have enough power and we've got a lot of demand, and the grid is kind of straining, if all of a sudden all of the solar on our roofs turn off, it's just going to make the problem worse. So they're working on a new standard now for smart inverters to really help stabilize the grid. So one of the things is, if the grid starts getting stressed, they don't turn off right away. They'll ride that through to try to help it out. Or if they notice a disturbance and need to turn off, they'll ramp down slowly. The utilities can also use these, send signals out to say, hey, you're producing too much, move it down a little bit to control it. And so through the smart inverter technology, we can now take the renewable energy that's causing problems with grid stability and make it help, make it a solution. Now, everything we've talked about up to this point has been changing supply to meet demand, saying, we're not going to change how you use electricity. You can use whatever you want, and then we'll accommodate. But that's not realistic, and going forward in the future, not only are we going to have to change the supply of electricity, we're also going to have to change how we use that and when we use that. The term for that is called demand response, and that refers to the demand of electricity and making it more responsive to signals. Now, the traditional demand response is mainly used by big commercial industrial buildings, where they can turn up the temperature a little bit on the thermostat, turn off their pump in front, turn off some lights, and shed a lot of energy. But traditional demand response is only for the hot summer days, those peak days. And in California, that's only 10 to 20 hours a year that we need to do this. So what happens, companies like Enernoc will go around and contract with a bunch of large commercial industrial buildings and say, hey, we might need you to turn down your power. We'll send you a signal, or we'll call you, and then you can turn it off for like the whole afternoon. But we won't do it too often, and we'll pay you for that. Even if you don't do anything, we'll pay you for the ability to ask you to do that. And so this is kind of what that does on the typical demand curve. The very peak, the grid is straining, we've turned on all of our generators, we just don't have enough, so we ask people to start using less. And that shaves that peak off a little bit. But the problem with the traditional demand response is it's only for these hot summer days. It's also a private thing. There's no open market for it. So I've got to come to San Jose State and say, hey, do you want to do this? Let's work on this. And I've got to go to the utility and say, hey, I've got San Jose State to do this, pay me for this. So it's not a very open market, a very easy process. Also, people don't like to be called. You don't want to have to turn off your air conditioner for 4 hours on a hot summer day and get all hot, or turn down the lights so that you can't see. It's kind of a pain. So that's where my company comes in. I work for a company called Ohm Connect, and what we do is we focus on not on the big buildings, but on houses, residentials. And what we call it is data energy sharing, because if you have some extra electricity, you can give it to your neighbors. If they've got some, they can give it to you. And the way it works is that we sign up people all throughout the country. We focus mainly on California now, but in every different area. We know exactly where they are. And then if there's a part of the grid, like those red dots, where there's a problem we need you to reduce, we'll send you a text and send you an email and say, hey, turn down your electricity. Go take a walk. Eat dinner by candlelight. And we do this for just an hour. We call them an Ohm hour. And that's not bad. You can turn off your air conditioner for an hour. It's not going to get hot. Or delay cooking for an hour. We also make it fun. So you win points for this, and you get paid. You can have spins and win prizes and tokens. You can compete with your neighbors. You can use it to raise money for your school or other nonprofit organization. So people really like to do this. It's fun. We also don't just do it those hot summer days. We do it constantly. We do 3 or 4 a week. Whenever the grid is stressed, which happens a lot when people turn on too many light bulbs or a power line goes down, we send the signal out to help balance the grid. So there's a couple of real advantages of this. Is one that it's real-time specific, it's very location specific, but it's also fun. People like to do this, so they'll do it a lot. Now we're paying people, so how do we get paid? Well, in the US today, there's not a lot of programs where we can pay because there needs to be kind of a confluence of different things. Number one, there needs to be smart meters. Because we need to detect how much you used yesterday and how much you used today when we ask you to reduce to see if you really did reduce, so we know how to pay you. There also needs to be regulatory laws in place to allow this to happen, and there needs to be an open market. So right now, the largest experiment in this is called the Demand Response Auction Mechanism, or DRAM, in California. And it started in 2016, and it's ramping up in 2017. And the idea is that we'll keep ramping up and be a permanent way of helping to balance the grid. Now, one way of looking at this is that it is trying to value negawatts the same as megawatts. Now, negawatts is a term used to describe reducing a negative watt. You go and turn something off, you're reducing demand. Now, if the grid is stressed, there's two things to do. One is put more power on the grid, and the other is reduce, take some off. Why shouldn't those be priced at the same thing? If you get $220 a megawatt hour to put power on the grid, why shouldn't you get paid $220 a megawatt hour to reduce it off the grid? That's what the DRAM program does. It also provides an open market that anyone can bid into to provide transparency and efficiency. People bidding against each other to provide the lowest cost service. Now, there's other places in the country doing something similar, but the DRAM is really the largest experiment in megawatt pricing that we have to date. And this is a big part of how Ohm Connect makes our money in order to be able to pay people. And then we get to storage. Now, storage is really kind of the holy grail of putting renewable energy on the grid. And in essence, all it's doing is it'll take the sun that's shining when no one is using and store that and then play it back at night when we're not using it. Also, it can smooth over those variations in wind and clouds that go over so that we have a very stable and smooth grid. If we put the storage in various different neighborhoods all over the grid, we also don't have these congestion problems because we can get power exactly where it's needed and take it where it's needed. We don't have to be transporting it a long distance. So I mentioned earlier that there's no storage on the grid, and that's not exactly true. There is some electric storage on the grid. Does anyone know what type that is? What kind of electric storage we have on the grid? Someone mentioned it a little bit earlier. Give you little hints. Does anyone know what this is? Hydro, right. It's called pumped hydro. And it's just like a regular dam where we've got a reservoir of water that's at a high elevation and flows through turbines and generates electricity. But with the difference is at the bottom, there's also a reservoir of water so they can pump it back up. So during the day, they can let it go down and be producing electricity for people. At night, when there's an abundance of electricity, the wind's blowing, we can't use it, they can pump it back up. Now, pumped hydro is a very efficient way of storing energy. The efficiency is high, there's no fossil fuels used, and they can turn around very quickly within minutes from a producing to a consuming mode. However, the problem with it is that it takes a very specific geography. You've got to have some reservoir high and some low in order to do this. Now, there's a lot of places that this doesn't work. For instance, Hoover Dam. It's a huge dam, produces a lot of electricity, but it all flows in the Colorado River and goes away. There's no pool down below that they can pull it back up from. Also, of course, building dams is very ecologically damaging. So right now in the United States, there's no pumped hydro dams planned at all. It doesn't look like we'll probably have any coming in the future. However, they're doing some interesting things now with abandoned mine shafts and flooding those and pumping water from those in order to get the same pumped hydro effect. There's just a few right now in Virginia and New York they're starting to do. There's some problems because a lot of these abandoned mine shafts have a lot of heavy metals in there and other corrosive things. But it's a really innovative way of doing that. So what other types of electric storage are there? Does anyone know in general? Yeah?
There's this way of storing energy using a flywheel.
Flywheels. Yeah. This is something they've been looking at for a long time. You know, spinning something really fast can store a lot of energy. You need to construct it very strong so it doesn't fly apart. But there are some places that actually are using flywheels. We're getting less and less of that now. I'm not sure if we've kind of hit a technological limit or there's just other things that are cheaper now. But certainly flywheels is one of the things that has been looked at and is still being used. Anything else? Anyone know anywhere else of storing? Batteries. We'll talk about batteries in just a second. Anything else? Yeah, thermal energy. I was just thinking that too, yeah. So thermal energy is really interesting as far as storage. If you have electric hot water heater, for instance, you can kind of heat it up at any time. So you could theoretically heat it all up at night, store that heat in there, and then use it during the day. there's also the Ivanhoe power plant out in the Arizona desert uses some storage here. They heat up a fluid and run it through, but they can store that to run several hours into the night. So there's ways of doing that at the utility level as well. There's another one using compressed air. There's a couple companies using compressed air to do that. Some of these will take a salt cavern and use water and dig it out and then store compressed air there to supplement a gas turbine. Because a gas turbine has to actually compress the air before it goes in. So they can store the compressed air in there and then use that to help boost the power of the gas turbine. So there's different ways of storing it, but one of the biggest ways they're looking at right now is batteries. The challenge with batteries is that we're still just kind of on the cusp of making it economical. They cost a lot and they don't last as long, and so your total cost is pretty high. A calculation I did several years ago put the degradation of the batteries at about 12 cents a kilowatt hour, which is it's more than the wholesale value of electricity is and about what you'd pay retail. So with that, it wasn't just quite economical to use it to store electricity, especially do load shifting where I was looking at doing it to charge those batteries up at night and then use them during the day to offset my electricity because it's less at night than during the day. But there are a lot of new advances in batteries with flow batteries and either lithium ion lasting a lot longer and the cost coming down. So it's starting to be competitive. This is an example of Tesla batteries. Tesla's doing the Powerwall. They're also doing some of these utility scale storage projects. And this is actually was down in Aliso Canyon. Is anyone aware of the Aliso Canyon problems they had this summer with the gas leak and having to turn off the plants? Being in Northern California, I don't know if we're as aware of it. But what happened is that a lot of places they do store natural gas underground in these big caverns, and then they use that for the generators nearby. Well, in Aliso Canyon, Southern California Edison had been storing it for years, but it was leaking. And neighbors were complaining, and they were ignoring it, and finally got shut down. They just came and said, no, you can't use this, you have to shut it down. And it caused a big problem because there's 3 big gas generators nearby that relied on that in order to produce the power. So Southern California Edison was all of a sudden faced with this issue of not having enough power to keep the lights on in the summer. So they were scrambling. They were doing energy efficiency, paying people to replace their light bulbs with LEDs. We were actually involved in a program for people to reduce during peak times. And they also started accelerating a lot of their battery storage programs. So Tesla was one of the ones that participated in this. They put a big battery storage unit. There's about a total of 70 megawatts of power done down there. And due to a lot of these things, Southern California people were able to keep their lights on this summer. So batteries are starting to be very big. The CPUC has actually ordered the utilities to implement 1.8 gigawatts of battery storage on the grid because they're realizing with this intermittent renewable energy, it's going to cause problems. They need it. Batteries can also help the utilities because instead of having to upgrade power lines, like we saw that line where all the solar in the middle of California moved to the coast, if you have battery storage, you can store more of the energy there, and you don't have to upgrade that line as quickly and save on your capital costs of improving that line. So there can be some other benefits to it. But battery storage is really kind of the holy grail, and if we get there, we can run the grid 100% renewable energy. So we've seen some of the dirty secrets, some of the challenges with integrating renewable energy on the grid, but we've also seen some of the ways of overcoming that. So I'm confident that in the future we'll be able to run our entire world on 100% renewable energy for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. So, questions? I've got to start it off. Max, you mentioned that you could put long-range DC power lines between energy production centers, like even Saudi Arabia to US, across Australia. What are some of the barriers to do this? Do you think it's feasible? Do you think it's a good idea?
It's really just a matter of cost. There is a market for transporting power, for transmission lines, the regular power, and once the economies start to be such that it makes sense to put in the capital cost, it's quite expensive to do that. But one of the things that they were looking at is putting in some power lines to Greenland, where there's a lot of thermal resources, and across the sea to Europe. And they actually were proceeding with some projects like that. So there are some economies of scale to do that, but it really just depends. It's going to be an economic principle. The other problem, of course, is what's called NIMBY, not in my backyard. It's really hard to put new transmission lines, especially in the United States, because people don't want it going through their yard. And you've got to get the permitting for every step of the way to be able to do that. And that's one of the biggest challenges now, is not only economics, is just being able to get the permitting to do that. Okay. Yes?
So it was a really small part of your talk, but as far as for nuclear energy, like Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, the last one in California, is expected to be decommissioned in 2025, and it's expected to take like 20 to 30 years, I believe, for the full decommissioning process, and it's going to cost like $4 billion in total. I was just wondering if you considered nuclear power to be like kind of worth it, like in investment-wise, because of the time and energy that we would have to spend decommissioning it in the long run.
Yeah, it's a hotly debated subject. There are some people who believe that it's going to be absolutely necessary to reduce our carbon. Because, of course, the big thing about nuclear is that it doesn't produce incremental carbon while you're running it. But there's lots of construction costs, and it takes on average about 9 years to build a power plant from start to finish. The Tesla battery pack was put in a few months. You know, and they could put in solar farms very quickly. Yeah, so there is a lot. In the whole decommissioning thing, you know, we still do not have a plan for nuclear waste in the country. All of the nuclear waste is stored on site at these facilities in the cooling ponds, and it's just sitting there because they don't know what to do with it. So it is a problem. Now, other countries, China and stuff, are proceeding with new nuclear power plants, and there's a lot newer technology and better technology available to do that. But when I look at the economics of solar, and that price coming down and wind coming down and batteries and everything to solve the problem with intermittency, I think it's going to be a matter of economics, really, that nuclear just doesn't make sense anymore, really, when we can implement renewable energy much cheaper and much quicker.
So I've actually used your company's website, Ohm Connect, and I was wondering if everyone was using Ohm Connect, how much of that curve would, instead of needing to ramp up so much, how much of that ramp would be diminished by people not using energy pretty much? Yeah,
good question. In the United States, about a third of our electricity usage goes to residential, a third commercial, a third industrial. So there's a big potential there. The other thing, too, is that nighttime curve is, a lot of that's residential. Businesses close down, go home. And so it can be a tremendous amount. It's also a lot more variable. It's easier for you as a consumer to like delay cooking for an hour than it is for like an aluminum smelting plant to turn off the smelters for an hour, or you know, another industrial facility. So it's going to be a major player in the balancing market, enabling more renewable energy on the grid. Of course, it's been really hard. It's a hard thing because you have so many little reductions that you need to control. The Enternox I talked about, traditional demand response, they might have 100 companies in their portfolio. We're going to have millions, and we need to control all that. And each one is not huge, you know. But combined, it can be big. So it's going to be a major part of being able to balance the grid.
Okay. Thanks for a fascinating talk, Max.
You're welcome.
Thank you, guys. See you next week.